Here's something nobody tells you about Friday the 13th. The superstition didn't come from folklore. It didn't come from some ancient pagan ritual or a horror movie or a bad dream someone had in the Dark Ages. It came from a single morning, one specific dawn, when the most powerful religious military order in the world was wiped off the face of the earth. And the church helped do it. October 13th, 1307. Before sunrise, sealed envelopes were opened simultaneously across every corner of France. Inside each one, the same order: arrest them, all of them, now. Hundreds of men dragged from their beds before they even knew what was happening. Men who had fought in the Crusades, men who had built hospitals across the Holy Land, men who had, for almost 200 years, been untouchable. The Knights Templar were done. But here's the thing: the story of how they fell isn't really about knights or battle or holy war. It's about money. It's about a king who owed more than he could ever repay, and it's about a pope who looked the other way while innocent men were tortured into confessing to crimes that in all likelihood never happened. That cover-up, the Church's decision to bury the truth about what actually happened to the Templars, is one of the most breathtaking acts of institutional cowardice in recorded history. Let's go back to the beginning. When the Templars were founded in 1119, they were 9 men, 9 knights who showed up in Jerusalem after the First Crusade with a simple enough mission: protect Christian pilgrims traveling through dangerous roads in the Holy Land. They were so poor at the start that 2 of them shared a single horse. That image became their seal: 2 knights on 1 horse, humility made permanent in wax. Nobody stayed humble for long. Within a decade, the order had received papal endorsement. Within a generation, donations from across Europe were pouring in: land, gold, castles, entire estates. Noblemen going off to fight in the Crusades would hand their properties to the Templars for safekeeping, and some never came back to claim them. The order grew, and then it did something genuinely revolutionary. It invented banking. If you wanted to travel from Paris to Jerusalem in the 1200s, a journey of months through hostile territory, carrying gold was a death sentence. Bandits, pirates, shipwrecks. So the Templars built a system. You deposit your gold at a Templar house in Paris, you receive a coded letter, you arrive in Jerusalem, present the letter at the Templar house there, and collect your funds. No gold moved, just information, just trust. Kings started borrowing from them, popes relied on them, the entire financial infrastructure of the crusading world ran through Templar accounts. And then the Crusades ended. By 1291, the last Christian foothold in the Holy Land, the city of Acre, had fallen. The Templars retreated to Cyprus. Their original purpose was gone, and suddenly Europe was looking at this organization, this enormously wealthy, answerable-to-no-one organization, and asking a question that had never been asked before. What exactly do we need them for? Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was asking a slightly different question. Philip was a king who lived beyond his means in ways that would be embarrassing even by modern standards. He had taxed the clergy until the Pope threatened him with excommunication. He had expelled France's Jewish population and seized their assets. He had debased the currency and triggered economic riots, and still he was broke. The Templars had lent him a fortune. Now, and this part matters, Philip owed the money he genuinely couldn't repay, and he knew something else. The Templars had their own treasury, their own courts, their own army. They answered to the Pope, not to him. They were a state within his state, and he couldn't touch them unless he could get the Church to declare them heretics. What Philip did next is one of the most calculated political maneuvers of the medieval world. He had already managed to install his own candidate as pope, Clement V, a Frenchman who moved the entire papal seat from Rome to Avignon, where Philip could keep an eye on him. A French pope, in France, funded by a French king. The pieces were in place. In 1307, Philip's agents began spreading rumors about the Templars. Whisper campaigns at first. Stories of secret rituals, idol worship, a head they supposedly venerated called Baphomet. Initiations where new members were made to spit on the cross. Accusals of the kind that in medieval Europe required no proof, only enough repetition to take on a life of their own. And then came that morning, that sealed envelope morning, October 13th. Hundreds of Templars arrested before dawn. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the entire order, a 70-year-old man who had dedicated his life to the church, was among them. They were thrown into cells and told they would confess. The torture that followed was not subtle. The rack, the strappado, fire applied to the soles of feet, in some cases, starvation. Medieval inquisitors understood pain in ways that are genuinely difficult to think about. And the confessions came. Of course they did. 36 Templars died under torture before they ever reached trial. The ones who survived said whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. They admitted to the idol, they admitted to the rituals, they admitted to spitting on crosses at initiation ceremonies. Under enough pain, a person will admit to anything. The church watched this happen. Clement V objected briefly, in the way powerful men object to things they've already decided to allow. He issued a papal bull claiming jurisdiction over the Templars himself. He gathered his own cardinals to re-examine the confessions. Then he read the confessions, and he accepted them. What happened next? What Clement and Philip decided to do with the Templars, and what the Church spent centuries trying to quietly bury, that's where this story really begins to get dark. Because the men who built that network, who fought those wars, who invented the concept of the international bank, they were about to be made into an example. And the institution that claimed to speak for God was going to strike the match. There's a document sitting in the Vatican's secret archives, though they've since rebranded it the Vatican Apostolic Archive, which tells you something, called the Chinon Parchment. For almost 700 years, nobody outside the church's inner circle knew it existed. It was discovered in 2001 by a scholar named Barbara Frail, who had been digging through the archive's catalog and noticed a misfiling. The document had been cataloged under the wrong heading, one category off. Whether that was an accident of medieval bureaucracy or something more deliberate is a question historians still argue about. What the parchment revealed changed everything we thought we understood about the Templar trials. The Chinon parchment, dated 1308, records a secret papal investigation into the Templars, separate from Philip's show trials. A group of cardinals sent by Clement V had met privately with Jacques de Molay and the other senior Templar leaders. The Knights, speaking without Philip's inquisitors in the room, told a different story. Yes, there were unusual rituals at initiation, a symbolic denial of Christ, then an immediate affirmation of faith, something the Templars described as a test of loyalty under pressure, a practice rooted in the reality of Crusader capture. If you were taken prisoner and your captor demanded you renounce your faith, could you hold firm? The denials, in other words, were theatrical, liturgical, not heresy. The cardinals listened, and the parchment records that at the end of the inquiry, Clement V issued those Templars a formal absolution. He found them innocent of heresy, and then he dissolved the order anyway. That's the part that should stop you. The Pope knew. He had seen the investigation. He had his own cardinal's report. He had the absolution he himself had granted. And when the Council of Vienne convened in 1311 to decide the Templars' fate, Clement stood before the assembled church leadership and announced that the order would be suppressed, not because they were proven guilty, but because their reputation had become too damaged to continue, because the scandal, whether true or false, was too large to survive. He chose institutional convenience over justice, completely, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what he was doing. He chose institutional convenience over justice, completely, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what he was doing. Philippe got what he wanted. The Templar properties in France were seized. The debts were erased. The most prominent members of the order were handed back to French secular courts, which meant, effectively, back to Philippe for final sentencing. Jacques de Molay had recanted his torture-extracted confession. So had Geoffrey the Charnay, the Templar preceptor of Normandy. Under medieval church law, recanting a heresy confession meant you'd relapsed into heresy. The punishment for that was death. March 18th, 1314. An island in the Seine River, in the shadow of Notre Dame. De Molay and de Charnay were brought out publicly to hear their sentence read, life imprisonment. De Molay, 70 years old, who had already been in chains for 7 years, stood up and did something that nobody expected. He rejected the sentence, out loud, in public. He said the charges were lies. He said the Templars were innocent. He said the only thing he was guilty of was betraying his brothers by confessing to things that weren't true, and he would not carry that shame into whatever time he had left. Philip ordered them burned that same evening. They didn't wait. Slow fires, apparently, the kind designed to extend suffering. Accounts from witnesses described de Molay as calm, facing the cathedral as he burned. The story that came down through the centuries, and this may be legend, though it was circulating within a year of his death, is that de Molay cursed both Philip and Clement from the flames, that within a year God would summon them both to judgment. Clement V died 33 days later. Philip IV died in a hunting accident before the year was out. Coincidence, almost certainly, but the kind of coincidence that sticks. Here's what the Church did next. For the better part of 7 centuries, the official position was that the Templars had been legitimately tried, legitimately found guilty, and legitimately dissolved. The Chinon parchment sat misfiled in an archive, hidden, accidentally or otherwise, from scholars who might have complicated that narrative. The story told to history was Philip's story, laundered through papal authority. The Vatican didn't formally publish the Chinon parchment until 2007. That's 2007, 699 years after Clement V wrote his absolution. They printed 799 copies in a limited facsimile edition, available for purchase at roughly $6,000 each, an act of transparency that also happened to be an act of inaccessibility. What it proved when scholars finally had access to it is something that many historians had long suspected but couldn't document. The institutional church had participated in judicial murder of innocent men, then spent centuries protecting the reputation of the institution over the memory of those men. Now, you might argue, and it's a fair argument, that the medieval church was a political entity as much as a spiritual one, that Clement V was operating under genuine constraint, that the alternative to cooperation with Philip might have been worse. There's real historical complexity here. This wasn't simple villainy in a cloak. But that complexity is exactly what was buried. The nuance, the absolution, the secret investigation, the knowledge that the confessions were extracted through torture, all of it went into an archive and stayed there. And that's the thing about institutional cover-ups. They're rarely the product of one evil person making one evil decision. They're usually the product of many careful people making many cautious decisions, each one slightly more dishonest than the last, until the distance between what happened and what is officially said to have happened becomes so vast that the truth feels almost impossible to retrieve. For the Templars, it took nearly 700 years, And the only reason we know what we know now is because a scholar got lucky with a misfiled document in an archive that used to be called secret. Makes you wonder what else is in there.